Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. First, I'm going to say a few thanks. First, I'd like to thank the interim director, Samantha Hardingham, as the head of the public program, its curator and head of lectures, Manager Verghese, for their faith and relevance in the relevance of this conversation. Professor Julia Black for her support on an institutional level and friendship to the school, and my current tutors, Mark Cousins, Mark Campbell, Thanos Sotogelis, Pierre Vittorio Orelli, and Maria Giudici for their kind of help and care. And to my colleague and co-organizer, actually, Konstantina Koulouri, who unfortunately is stuck in Moscow, couldn't be here. Freefall, which is this series, was conceived as a drive to construct conversations in the form of trajectories against architecture, to think what it traditionally, conventionally, and uncritically has come to represent, in order to assess the relevance of how we as architects and architects in training can operate. It hopes to do this by bridging disciplinary gaps. And so today, bringing in practitioners in those other fields to discuss common ground, quite literally the commons, communes, and collections of cultural memory. So I'd just like to introduce our speakers, and I'd like to thank them for coming at such short notice. Iain Boal is a social historian of science, techniques, medicine, and the commons. Since moving to the US in 1982, he has taught the earth sciences and community studies at Harvard, Stanford, the University of California, and the San Francisco Art Institute. He is associated with The Retort, a group of antinomian writers, teachers, artists, and artisans based in the Bay Area. With James Brooke, he co-edited Resisting the Virtual Life, The Culture and Politics of Information, and with TJ Clark, Joseph Matthews, and Michael Watts, co-authored Retort's Affiliated Powers, Capital and Spectacle in a New Age of War. A few things. He's affiliated with the Geography Department at USC Berkeley, is a recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship in Science Technology, and a founder of Mayday Rooms, which is a social space and a safe haven for archives at 88 Fleet Street in London. He's co-edited West of Eden, which he's hopefully going to talk about today, Communes and Utopia in Northern California, and is author of The Green Machine, which is a forthcoming heterodox history of the bicycle in planetary perspective. He's the director of the Stokesby Institute of Geohistory and Material Arts. And then our second speaker, Tim Iverson, is an interdisciplinary scholar and artist working on the political ecology of modern cities and urban planning. He teaches in both liberal arts and history and theory at SciArc and in the cultural studies at Cal Arts. He is a contributor to The Real View and editor of Off Ramp, which is part of SciArc. Recent curatorial projects include TEOTWAWKI and Operations Theatre before present in LA. In 2016, he completed a PhD in Humanities and Cultural Studies at the London Consortium with a thesis on biopolitics and environmental discourse. And from 2014 to 2016, Iverson was an Andrew W. Mellon Foundation researcher at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal. And then Ruth Beale is an artist whose work considers the evocative relationships between culture, governance, and social discourse and representation. Her practice includes performance, installations, films, and socially engaged processes. She's a co-founder of Performances Publishing, an active research project into text and writing for performance, the Alternative School of Economics, which uses the practice of self-education to reclaim and explore economics as a social subject. She has performed and exhibited at the Whitechapel Gallery in London, the ICA, Turner Contemporary, the Basel Kunsthalle, MoMA Ps1, South London Gallery, and Modern Art Oxford. And she gained an MFA in Fine Art from Goldsmiths in 2010. So thank you very much for being here. Thank you everyone for attending. Iain, hopefully we'll...
Actually, we agreed that I would go first. Sorry.
Okay. That's all right. Tim?
Switched it up on you. Yeah,
no worries.
Sorry about that.
Do you have the screen?
Yeah, hang on a second. Just pull it up. That work? Yeah. Okay, yeah, thanks Moad for the introduction. I'm gonna try to keep this to 20 minutes. Moad asked me to speak about my art practice, which has, and I have to say at the very beginning that almost all of the art projects that I've been involved in the last decade have been collaborative. Many, perhaps not all, but a vast majority are with Julia Charfis, my partner and collaborator, and so I've put her in there. And most of the projects you'll see are collaborations with Julia. So I'll just say that right at the start. And start right now. Okay, so maybe one way, and it's kind of weird to start with an image that is not my own, but this is kind of what I would refer to as a source image, something that kind of motivates or is a kind of touchstone for various projects that we've done. This is the first world exhibition of interplanetary spacecrafts and mechanisms from Moscow, 1927, which was a storefront exhibition put together by a group of rocket engineering enthusiasts to promote the idea of space travel. Officially, most of them were amateurs. The exhibition is not organized by a curator as such. It could probably be described as propaganda. But they were deeply invested in a kind of cosmos philosophy and in the science of spaceflight. Some of the people involved in these projects ended up working within the government and eventually influencing the space program later, but at this time it was a purely kind of speculative visioning exercise, right? And so we found this quite interesting and tried to incorporate ideas around this project into some of the things that we do. So this, for instance, is a project that we did at the Chisenhale where we got a planetarium teaching dome, inflatable dome, and had it installed for a few hours within the space so that we could do a performance lecture with a number of elements from different exhibitions that we had done and research that we were pursuing around closed systems, space travel, and counterculture, and did the whole lecture with a 360-degree lens projected onto the inside of the dome. That right there on the right is a drawing by Tsiolkovsky, one of the original kind of theorists of cosmism and the three-stage rocket. These are images from an exhibition that we did around the same time at Hillary Crisp Gallery in Whitechapel. We were looking at, we did a series of exhibitions, I guess, where we worked with images. We tried to think about images as artifacts, ordering them, amassing them, perhaps with an allusion to Abby Warburg's Mnemosyne Atlas, trying to think of them as systems of thought or ways of thinking through different issues. We were looking at the globe or world-making techniques, seeing how they were kind of figured or how they could be framed as part of a history of planetary scale thinking. This is a detail from a subsequent project at Tenderpixel. Yeah, and throughout a lot of the projects, as you can see, maybe just by contrast, the inflatable dome and then this kind of modular structure, we were always interested in a variety of different display mechanisms and thinking of display systems and typologies as both sculpture and as ways of staging either discourse or research or thinking through objects in space and the kind of way that people move around exhibition spaces as a sculptural question. And this maybe is a way of jumping forward to more recent projects. We both moved to Los Angeles in 2015. And part of that was, everything kind of changed and everything was the same, right? A new city, a new kind of artistic milieu, but the same kind of concerns. And we were trying to think about how to restage our kind of artistic discourse in Los Angeles. And one of the things that we decided to do was really focus on archives, collecting, cataloging practices, and essentially, we started an apartment gallery, right? But the idea was that we wouldn't show contemporary art, we wouldn't show our friends' work, that we would rather focus on collecting as a kind of practice, so we would be more likely to show someone's collection in their closet than the work in their studio, if that makes any sense. But still think of this in artistic terms. Still think of this as a kind of staging of a discourse around artifacts and objects. And so we started something called Before Present. Oh, there's no internet connection. Before Present is a phrase that comes from radiocarbon dating. It's basically a kind of a convention of radiocarbon dating where the present is 1950, when radiocarbon dating was invented. It also has been interpreted as a way of referring to when nuclear testing first started. And with radiocarbon dating, nuclear testing skews the results. And so it's a really useful marker for now, right? But we were taking this in perhaps more loose terms, but still kind of signaling this, looking at the past, looking at archives, thinking about how things are dated or periodized, where they come from, how they kind of come to be thought of as artifacts. So far we've only done 2 shows, but we're working on quite a few. I'll look at, so Teotihuacan, The End of the World as We Know It, was a show about Y2K. About the millennium and the millennium bug. If people were born after the millennium, you might not remember that this was a really big deal. People thought it was going to be the end of the world. There was a fear that computers were programmed in such a way that they would basically zero out at the stroke of midnight on the millennium. And all of the global systems that were now running on certain kinds of processors would fail, right? So the stock market would fail. Logistics would be stopped in their tracks. All kinds of basic services would be threatened. And so this led to a lot of skepticism and a lot of humor around that, but also a lot of people who were quite concerned that this was actually a very real and present problem. And what people forget, and even I didn't really realize until doing the work on this show, is that it was actually a problem, and something like $3 billion were spent fixing it. It was not a hoax, which sometimes people forget. So we installed it like a bunker, basically. We tried, we as curators or as artists creating this installation, and we really try not to make too much of a distinction between the two, we thought about this as a bunker. And built this kind of rack system, which is also the same kind of racks that you would use to store artifacts in a museum. So there's a kind of double entendre between preppers and preparator in the way that we installed this show. All of the objects have something to do with, all of the objects and media have something to do with Y2K. A lot of them were found on eBay, others were found locally. We realized when we started to do this show that we had lots of friends who also collected Y2K memorabilia, or whose parents were preppers and were quite afraid of the new millennium. There's a whole lot of kind of humorous objects, but there's also a lot of apocalyptic thinking that went on around this. So in the same issue of Wired magazine, you have this desolate post-apocalyptic landscape, but on the back of the same issue, you have an absolute Y2K ad for vodka, right? So it's very hard to tell whether you were supposed to take this event seriously or not. And the artifacts demonstrate that. The range, the huge range of things that were produced around Y2K. Here's a prepper's guide, building your ark. I mean, this was not ironic by any means. But then you have a board game, Y2K Special Edition board game. And a number of films and art projects that were made. This is a film strip of photographs that were taken by a friend of ours at the stroke of midnight as the ball dropped, people celebrating the end of the world. Yeah, and then of course you have the normal, well, here you have conspiracy theories, films that were made on the back of this project, and then also just the normal yearly celebrations. So this was a way of trying to kind of bring this material back to life, to present it as a kind of total environment, and to mix maybe contemporary art sensibilities with maybe more vernacular objects and attitude towards the materials. This whole thing was done in our house for our friends. It wasn't advertised as an art show. It was just kind of presented in our house like this for about a month. And part of this is also the archive that we created around it. So you'll see some of these objects in the collection's catalog. So here you have a more kind of forensic approach to the same material. Bill Nye the Science Guy. The actual Y2K bug. This great hat, which I saw in a video recently. Yep, so this is the kind of inventory, right? And so this is also another way of treating this more like a proper collection. All these things have entered the archive. They have been accessioned. So, following on that, and also kind of bringing in some of the influences from the earlier exhibitions, we did another show called Operations Theater. And Operations Theater is a way of talking about durational performance and theater, essentially, within scientific practice. So looking at laboratory experiments that involve durational performance. And in those durational performances, some kind of imagination of what the world is within the experiment, right? And so this involves 3 or 4 projects, Operation Everest, the Institute for Biomedical Problems in Moscow. Again, this kind of Soviet space science theme comes back. NASA's Technology Utilization House, and the Theater of All Possibilities, Institute of Ecotechnics, both of which lead to Biosphere 2. And I can kind of come back to these things if that's not clear. But the installation we did as a kind of black box theater, right? Like a kind of, I don't know, how you might find, someone might come and do a monologue on this stage at kind of a local theatrical production. It's very kind of, our theater tech skills are very basic, but we kind of embrace that. And also, again, every time we do an exhibition, we have to kind of integrate this into the living room. So it's a balancing act. This is the Institute of Biomedical Problems film. It's a Russian, essentially a propaganda film. It has a narrative, but it involves, I'm not sure why. They decided that part of the narrative of this documentary should involve one of the test subjects falling in love with one of the technicians. And so there's a happy ending in which they get married at the end. But essentially, it's a documentary about these test subjects, these men who enter this chamber, this closed system that it doesn't exchange any air with the outside for a month, and they're meant to live both in the space atmospherically, but also psychologically with each other. And this is a test to see. A test of the feasibility of long-term space travel, right? And there were quite a number of these types of experiments done in the Soviet Union during the space race. I'll just kind of skip forward. So this is Operation Everest, which was also a military experiment, but a US military experiment, where these men were put into another kind of closed system where the barometric pressure in the room was dropped slowly over the course of some time until they got to 29,000 feet. So every day they were asked to do exercises, to eat a certain diet, and to write their name and respond to certain questions to test their focus and their physical condition. And of course, as the pressure continued to drop, their performance also changed. And there's an amazing archive of this material in San Diego. So I think I'm going to move forward a little bit just to get through the rest of these. The Theater of All Possibilities, also an interesting group. They formed as a group in the late 60s, moved to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and started a whole series of performances basically exploring and preparing for an experiment that would later take shape in the 90s as Biosphere 2, which was a 3.15 acre closed system made of steel and glass in which 8 people lived for 2 years within a closed system that included a whole series of ecological zones or biomes. But to do that, they did all kinds of things. To get to that point, they did all kinds of things. They were kind of invested in theater as a way of rehearsing and projecting future scenarios. They produced a diet around their practice. They took on a kind of different kinds of characters. This is their performance piece, the kind of key piece that we were referencing in the show, The Wrong Stuff, which is a play on, of course, The Right Stuff, the American space film. In theirs, they try to play out everything that could possibly go wrong with this experiment, so they could be both psychologically and emotionally prepared for the worst. And they even did a comic book based on this script, which we had in the exhibition. So, and this example, I think, really plays up the fact that theater practice literally has a role in these experiments, which, when you get to the point of Biosphere 2, are, I mean, this was a totally legitimate and real ecological experiment. I mean, it was no longer in the realm of the stage, but in a sense, it still had those, in a sense, it was completely. I mean, it's kind of hard to explain, but, there's this continuity in the logic of the project, which is super fascinating. Yes. And Tech House. This one has a slightly different tenor to it. Basically, with NASA, one of the things that they tried to focus on was spin-off technologies, how to rationalize space travel, essentially, as a productive division of the US government that was not simply spending billions of dollars to send men on spectacular missions to the moon, but also producing usable technologies, right? And Tech House was literally a prototype suburban house filled with technologies that had been tested in space. So new solar panel technologies, new irrigation technologies, air filtration systems, materials that had been either used or tested in space. And the idea was to show how these new technologies could be integrated into a suburban environment. And it's not just the design elements. They also hired a family. There it is on the edge of, you can see right on the edge of that field of panels is the suburban house in the middle of, I believe it's the Langley Research Center. But they also hired a family. They commissioned a family to live there as a suburban family, as this kind of prototypical family that would use these technologies and report back, right? So they're also engaged in a kind of performance. It's not a closed system. They're not under duress, unless you think of the nuclear family as perhaps being under some kind of duress or closed system. You can, if you want. Yeah, and then with this section of the show, we also included the Ecosphere, right? Which is this also, I would say, a kind of touchstone project or image, which is literally this closed system in which, and it's our only pet actually, which is a shrimp that lives in a closed system in this sphere which is sealed with water and algae. And the algae receives sunlight and produces food for the shrimp, which then eats it, which then poops it out, and then the algae grows, and then it keeps going. Until that system actually reaches a kind of disequilibrium, and then it kind of falls apart. But this one's been running for 2 or 3 years, so we're lucky. So that's the current work. The next show will be about a freeway that was supposed to run through the house. The house that we're in right now is actually a rental. We rent it from the state of California, and they bought it by eminent domain in 1964, I believe. And they intended to bulldoze it along with 460 other houses and build the final section of the 710 freeway, which I don't know if you can see it in this image, but you can kind of see the 2 stubs of the 710 north-south on the, going through Pasadena, South Pasadena, and Alhambra. this is a little image of all of the properties that would be destroyed by this freeway. The freeway project has been canceled. The tunnel project, which replaces it, is almost canceled. When they will release these properties, nobody knows. It's the transit authority. These are all the alternatives. I'm just going to run through this because I'm out of time. But this is just a preview of the kind of material we're working with for this this freeway show. And there is some pretty amazing maps, illustrations, a whole history of resistance to this project, and a lot of good reasons why it has been the longest running freeway dispute in American history. So yeah, this might be our future as well. So, okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you. And now we have Iain Boal.
Yeah. Well, thanks to Moad for the invitation, and I know Tim had some part in it. I've just come in from California myself. I'm a little jet lagged, but they thought it might be a good idea if I said something about the West of Eden project, in relation to, of which this book is a kind of summa. It began actually with in a way, its genesis was a phone call in December of 1999, on the eve of the millennium. I got a call from Cal Winslow, who's one of the editors of that. I had known Cal because we shared a mentor, Edward Thompson, the historian. Some of you might know E.P. Thompson's work. And Cal, who grew up on the longshore in Seattle, his father was a longshoreman, and Cal Winslow became a young, fiery Trotskyist, but who came to work with Thompson on the basis of reading the making of the English working class. And Cal heard me on the radio. I'd gone on to a local radio in Northern California, invited to talk about the panic over the millennium and numerology and the history of these kinds of panics. And I happened to mention Thompson's great essay on time, work discipline, and industrial capitalism. And he called me up. I was in Berkeley, and we reconnected, became good friends. And one of the things that struck us was Cal, particularly, who'd rusticated to Mendocino County, when he started becoming a broker in all the kinds of problems that people have with the, you've got to remember that was the year of just before the dot-com bubble burst in February of 2000. So there was waves of young tech millionaires coming with checkbooks, buying up chunks of land in Mendocino. And he was brokering a lot of interesting meetings on all the kinds of problems that people have when that kind of inundation happens, having to do with housing and jobs and the forest. And he found to his surprise that the people who were coming to a lot of these meetings were in fact old, rusticating back to the landers and hippies, which defeated his stereotype, which is basically that the politicos stayed in town to fight the man, resisting Vietnam War, and those who simply turned their backs to start a new life were not political. It turns out not to be true. The West of Eden project, we begin with a kind of rough heuristic of the city versus the country, but that was very soon defeated. And it turns out there were very strong connections between these two spheres. The most famous of the communes in the Bay Area was in a kind of third space in the hinterland, which is about 45 minutes out of town, and it eventually became completely overrun by weekend hippies. The man who, this is Morning Star Ranch, which was purchased by an ethnomusicologist and brilliant stand-up comedian, trickster called Lou Gottlieb, who thought he had a kind of a savage critique of capitalist privatization and private property, and thought that the answer to that was to simply declare the land open come one, come all. Now, this shows a very serious forgetting of the history of commoning. And you've got to remember that the continent was, of course, full of, not of course, but was full of commoning cultures. As the Western Anglos punched their way over the Appalachian crest for the enclosure of North America, they met resistance, famously by the young warrior Tecumseh, who said to his elders, they're coming for all of this. We need to stop them here now, envisaging a line of resistance from the Gulf of Mexico up to the Great Lakes. It didn't work. This was the War of 1812. There were more troops. The British state was arming the Native Americans for their own purposes. Actually, there were more troops out against the Luddites here at that year, when Byron gave that tremendous talk in his maiden speech in the Lords, never gave another speech, against Judge Jeffreys and the hanging of the Luddites for machine breaking. This is all part of the planetary privatization that was going on. And we were living in the rubble of that, and still are in a way in the Bay Area, not to mention the old world. So this project was an attempt to recover like a bottle that we would put a message in and throw it into a tornado. Who knows where it'll fetch up? But a lot of what went on there, which was completely improvised, they reinvented gleaning, for example. Who knows what gleaning is? Some of you might, but a lot of they didn't even have the word. So when we went to do field work in the country, we found old hippies who used to have what they call canning weekends. They'd go into the big fields and pick up the stuff left over from the mechanized harvesting, which was too expensive. The labor was too expensive. Even Mexican stoop labor was too expensive, and so they would be able to feed themselves for months. It's a hard scrabble life if you've just left the city and don't know shit about, autonomous living. They didn't know that they were gleaning. So the extinction of that social memory was part of what drove us on. We still don't understand quite why there was this burst of collective communal energy. It was in some ways a resistance to, plastics. And for those of us who are enemies of the present order of things, and I address those of you in this room especially who are, one of the real problems is trying to memorialize the kind of negative victories that have been most of what makes the world still remotely livable. That's to say, when Tim showed these fascinating fantasies of Caltrans, the freeway system that they had planned for the Bay Area, simply staggering. They were going to fill in the bay. That was stopped. Again, so it's a negative victory. How do you celebrate the fact that they did not fill in the bay? Those were 6 women who got together, could see what was coming, and that the Save the Bay movement, which is a kind of NIMBYism. I mean, I'm dead in favor of NIMBYism of the right kind. I won't hear a word against NIMBYs because, again, that's a right-wing kind of attack often on neighborhood resistance. Of course, we want a critique of NIMBYism, but anyway, so these women, long before the internet, they sat round, and it was probably only something that they might have thought of, which was that they started this movement by simply collating their Christmas card lists, addresses, and sent them out, and that started a movement which saved the bay. It was also women who stood in the face of the freeway revolt, which prevented some of the horrors. We still, of course, live in the your lives and what's left of mine will be spent in the long aftermath of the fantasies of automotive engineers and traffic consultants from the 1930s. I mean, you go to the World's Fair 1939 and you look at what they had in mind, well, that's what we're living in. And I've written The Green Machine, which is coming out next year, partly because to try to upset the complacency of cyclists, among whom I don't put myself outside this, because it was the roadway, it was the cyclists who demanded first. The Good Roads movement was for cyclists who above all need a smooth surface. The most important thing we got out of the West of Eden project, I believe, apart from the recovery of some of these memories and trying to push back against the great forgetting, the massive de-skilling that's going on globally, the unbelievable amount of skills, quote, that are going into oblivion. I do really think that the most important thing we found was that when we're talking about the commons, and who isn't a communist now? You can't walk down the street without bumping into people who fetishize the commons. Those of us who have struggled for decades under the sign of the commons, it's a salutary business to watch this. In the States, by the way, to say commons is a way not to say Marxist or something like that, Anti-communism, anti-communism, they're very closely and they're historically related. I'd say the most important thing we found was that we need to insist on a three-way distinction between commons, private, and public. Public is importantly the opposite of private, for sure. That's probably what you would have to say at the first cut. But then you need to say that actually, in a way, it's the other face of it. Again, for those native peoples who were facing the invasion, if you look at the ordinance of the late 18th century, all that land that was where the genocide was happening, was first declared public land, okay? The territories, so-called, all right. And the bosses in Washington were waiting for enough people, settlers, white settlers, to populate an area so that they could then get statehood and so on. So public was a holding category on the way to privatization. And you have to understand that some of the interesting folks who were the precursors of the counterculture and whatever it is that interesting burst of radical energies that we call the 60s. Going back to the 19th century in the Bay Area, one in particular, some of you might have been to the Sequoia National Park in California, which is not as famous as Yosemite, but it's a very interesting one because the Kauai colony was there, K-A-W-E-A-H. Now this was a bunch of socialists, weird antinomians, vegetarians, spelling reformers, and assorted crackpots who went logging. I mean, it was not an ecological vision they had, but they were going to go logging to take out the redwoods. And they arranged to go and make land claims, which was part of the federal project to populate the hinterland. And they got pieces of land that were contiguous, and they found themselves this colony in the middle of California. The biggest tree they called the Karl Marx tree, the next one was Frederick Engels, and so on. They've all been renamed. But the cavalry had to go in to get rid of them. And they did that not just with the cavalry, but by declaring it a public national park. So the national parks, which are the glory of the US in many ways, and particularly the built world inside the parks, some of the most magnificent buildings are actually, of course, a kind of social democratic residue from the big capitalist emergency of the mid-20th century, the New Deal project. And Gray Breckin is doing a wonderful job excavating all that New Deal work that's gone down the memory hole. You have to remember that at the stroke, Sequoia National Park became a park after midnight back in the 19th century. And at the moment it becomes a national park, at that moment, all the commoning, and commoning for me is a kind of is a verb. It's a social relation as much as anything else. All the commoning practices immediately become criminalized. That's to say, the gathering of mushrooms and ferns and downward, all the things that Thompson and Cal Winslow and Peter Lineborn, those of us working in the history of the commons, all those rights which go back to the Magna Carta and the Charter of the Forest from 1217, all those become criminalized. And of course, that's the livelihood for all the people, the Miwok and the Ohlone and those who lived along the Pacific Littoral. That's immediately criminalized. So that's why I say it's very important, I think, to kind of nuance this question of commons, which we certainly need, I think, to push back against a state-centered historiography. And I maybe have a couple of minutes left, do I, Moad?
Yeah.
In that respect, I want to alert you, some of you might already have heard of it. There's a marvelous book recent book, a sort of compilation of work by the man who runs for many years has run a wonderful seminar in New Haven, an agrarian historian and sociologist, the forestry seminar. James Scott. His new book, Against the Grain, is fascinating because it bids to completely revise, I think, the historiography of what it is to mean to become human. The idea that humans have always been basically waiting to get settled turns out to be kind of nonsense. There's a 4,000-year missing gap that can't be accounted for, but it's all been glossed over by those who take a sedentist, state-centered view of things. So the improvised world and the nomadic life, all that becomes heterodox and unofficial. And I think that also puts in a different light the improvised world that's at the heart of West of Eden. It's sad in a way that, millennia of building wisdom got overthrown by the architecture without architects. I can't tell you how many of the old hippies I met who believed that their rubbish joinery could be redeemed with an orbital sander. Sad business. It's not that they even, if they would have done better to have some kind of Japanese aesthetic where at least they took pleasure in bad joinery. But why spend time if you don't need it to be looking good? But I'm serious about that. I think that we need to rediscover, as many of these people did, these skills that they didn't know they had lost. Tim has recently been to Salmon Creek, one of the communes up on Albion Ridge, which was about 3 hours north of San Francisco. And there was a whole bunch of different communes, again, very improvised, often in buildings there were absentee landlords. It was a hard scrabble life that was overtaken by industrial agriculture. And among these communes, they were different kinds: Marxist, Leninist, Earth Mothers, lesbian separatists, you name it. One of them was led by a guru/predator. For guru, read predator often, sad to say, who had gone there because it was an old airstrip that the Navy had ready in case of nuclear war. And he thought it would be a good way to bring up marijuana before the miracle of cannabis improvement in California. And he'd gone into the Navy, into the Air Force, as a way to get high. It was before Tim Leary. He thought, well, I want to get high. So he joined the Air Force. And it was fascinating to talk to these old timers. And I'll just say again, I'll finish by saying that I don't want to romance the 60s. And I personally became a kind of a rebel without having really any background in it. I was a partial rebellion at one of these boarding schools I was sent to. But I found that when we came to, and this will be my last thought here, when we came to do the ethnography, it's an unmastered past, and I think I invite you to, whatever you do, I think the historicizing of art practice and research is a very valuable thing, although it's nice to meet somebody who just says, I'm a painter, but just a painter, But when we had our first meeting, both in the city, in one of the abandoned warehouses in San Francisco. A lot of them were artists just looking for northern light and some big space. And when we had a meeting up in the schoolhouse that they'd built with their own hands, and we sat round in a circle, and some of these were communards who hadn't seen each other for many years. And one of them said, as I was going to sort of wrap up the meeting and get the sense of, try and rehearse a sense of where we were at that first meeting, as we began to do the ethnography. I think I used the word failure. I mean, one noticed that these things had a trajectory, all these experiments, and it seemed to be a life history of birth, flourishing, and death. So it was always a certain kind of sadness to it. And we learned on the way that, you cannot tell anything about the success of something by its longevity. I think you should remember that always. There were plenty of people who only spent a few weeks living in common. But they carried it in their hearts, and still do. So when I use the word failure, one of them over here, there's a Red Wing, said, you pointy heads, you come up from Berkeley and you tell us we're failures. I would not give up one day of my life in living in common. Not one day of it. And then from the other side of the room, not to me, but to the person, to Red Wing, came a reply which said, I agree with that. And whoever earlier said that it was a failure, I say to you, and she turned to a third person and said, I know what your dreams were, how dare you agree that it was a failure, We had the same dream, That is nonsense. I knew what you were then, So we knew that we were dealing with an unmastered past. And I don't think we had the same kind of sense of possibility when we recently had a gathering of some of these people who had come together to discuss their commoning practices. And of course, we live in a different moment now. The warehouses aren't there and so on. The space for these experiments, it's very, very hard to know what to do now. So I have an out here. I'm just a historian. I do live in a common, I have to say that. And it's pretty tough. Collective decision-making, it's bloody exhausting. What can I say? Anyway, I thank you for allowing me to come to say these things, and I look forward to hearing Ruth and to having a conversation in a bit. Thank you.
I'm going to show you or present one work, but it's sort of two works put together. But I'll just say something about my work before. So in a big way, I'd say that my art practice is concerned with how we, sort of as individuals, negotiate culture, society, structures of society, how those things are kind of delivered top down, how we engage with those things from the bottom, how we organise. And that comes out in all sorts of ways, from being part of a cooperative studio and totally knowing what you mean about those decision-making processes, to setting up organisations, to running these kind of self-education school experimental projects, to being interested in libraries and archives and these structures and ways of organising information, and thinking about what we keep and what we save. And then I think perhaps quite recently in relation to this project, thinking about that relationship individually in terms of something bodily as well, and how we as individuals, as people, engage with the common. This is what this work is about. So this work has footage that was filmed from a drone in London's Common Land over 8 weeks. So I was filming, there's this kind of dubious legal area of about whether that is okay or not, because you can fly drones, you can't film for commercial purposes. So I did all the filming, I would say, as a hobbyist, and then made work for commissions in another capacity. One thing I'd like to give you before I start is that, because I want you to think about your bodies and your movement, I'm going to give you something to hold.
Oh, thank you.
Just to think about making some tiny movements. Yourselves with your hands, and maybe that will make you more aware of your other movements you're making, and there's some kind of instructions in the work as well. So these are pieces of porcelain that were all hewn from the same lump. So you all have I've got one. So you all have a piece from the same lump of porcelain. So this work is kind of brought together from a performance and a web commission. So you'll see the web commission had these little videos and audio clips that you could play simultaneously, and I'm going to do that to start with, and then I'm going to read part of a script for a performance over the top for the second half, and it's called Who Owns It? Can I Hold It?
Day. Shared, familiar, shared, every day, unfamiliar, familiar, every day, familiar, every day, natural, familiar, every day, colloquial, every day, prevalent, familiar, every day, shared, familiar, shared, every day, unfamiliar, familiar, every day. In the Palace of Westminster, the knives and forks are stamped with hallmarks and counted at the start and end of each shift. But who owns that cutlery? Who owns Parliament? The buildings and the benches, the corridors of power, the dining rooms and offices. Put your hands in your pockets. Put your hands behind your head. I wonder, does my question about Parliament locate us post-Thatcher, post-Blair, born and raised on market forces, where everything has a price? Central government owns 16 million square metres of land, presumably accumulated over the centuries through whatever feudal system, then nationalised industry. Now, as the municipal is privatised, land deals and development mean it's leased back to the state. Like City Hall, owned by the Qataris. Unpiloted viewpoint. The consumer drone gives an unparalleled opportunity to look down, to take an unmanned, unpiloted viewpoint, to gain perspective. The permitted flight zone, not within 50 metres of another person or above 122 metres, constitutes a common airspace, an unprivatised bit of air from the corporeal to the ethereal, a spatial shift upwards. You are walking on the common. You look up. As I speak, think about your movements. Focus on the muscles of your forehead. Raise your eyebrows. Who owns this land? Who owns this land? This scrubby piece of green and brown, this deep sodden earth, these brambles. Not all commons have owners, but by definition, common land is registered, along with the rights of the commoners where they still exist. Graze your cattle here. Take leisure. Join the collective experience. Tap your feet. Clench your buttocks. Think for a moment about how cultures around the world use rhythm and movement to heal. How the Kalahari Bushmen get into a trance state and dance until they're exhausted to heal illness. Lift your pelvic floor and hold 2, 3, 4, relax. Our conception of ownership is so enlightenment, so industrialist, so post-industrialist, so capitalist, so post-capitalist. Property must have an owner, right? Common law is older than Parliament, older than democracy. 3,000 hectares over 125 commons. These slices, these chunks, these fragments of London are the last vestiges of a shared economy. Just try a little head roll. Bring your left ear towards your shoulder and roll your head forward and round to the other side. And back the other way. Where is democracy? Can you prove it? Can I hold it? Can I roll it in my hand and squeeze it? Where does the buck stop? Not an office in the Cayman Islands or a board of trustees, but with the people, right? Our consciousness is limited or corrupted. The only way to secure your future is property as investment. Voters are happy as long as the house prices keep going up. Suck in your stomach. Have we lost the ability to conceive of the common? Where the commons is located, practically, philosophically. Like how our brains can't comprehend an infinite universe. It must stop somewhere, right? Commons. Common. 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 Commons. The common. The commons. The commons. Common. Common. No fires, no motorbikes. The common. The commons. No parking between 1 hour after sunset and 1 hour before sunrise. Common. No climbing on the trees, no fishing without a licence, no hunting, no lopping, no foraging, no gathering. No bedding down. No fires, no motorbikes, no camping, no parking between 1 hour after sunset and 1 hour before sunrise. No climbing on the trees, no fishing without a licence, no hunting, no lopping, no foraging, no gathering. No bedding down. This common land in the sunshine, dog walkers and kite flyers. A path is worn into a small mound. At the top there are benches, rough hewn from tree trunks. You sit and rest and eavesdrop on a conversation about the election. A young woman says she's not political. You know what she means. She's not interested in politics. But it pricks your ears, gets under your skin. Benign acceptance is complicity with the ruling class. That feeling of despair, that lack of agency, is what keeps us in our place. Once, these commons were part of the estates of the feudal lords granted by the crown. The commoners had the right to use them. We have a right to be here. We have a right to be here. Before water was privatised in 1989, it was inconceivable to many that this basic resource, this element, this common, could be privately owned and distributed. Since then, tariffs and profits have gone up, but so has quality, marginally. Listen. Stop and listen. Breathe in. Suck the air right down to the bottom of your lungs, into your stomach, and breathe out. A class action launched by asthma sufferers against this government's inability or lack of political will to reduce carbon emissions. Capital puts a on the air. Perhaps they will privatise this next. Streets as commons, trees as commons, air as commons, daylight as commons, shade commons, clean water as commons, rivers as commons, libraries as commons, museums as commons, markets as commons, schools as commons. Stop and sit still. Feel the weight of your body against the chair, pushing down. You're at an all-night sit-in in a university library, an unconference, a read-in, claiming the library as a public space. You occupy. You rub your eyes. What is a university? Where is it? Not the building, not the glass and bricks and cladding leased from a developer. Not the exempt charity as listed in Schedule 2 of the Charities Act 1993. Is it the staff, students, alumni? Art school is about the conversations. It's not a transaction. You're doing really well, but you're going to have to increase your capacity and work a bit harder. It's the international market room now. The students expect it. And with the streamlining we've had to do, your department just needs to step up to the plate. You are working in a porter cabin at a music festival, checking off the guest list, handing out passes, AAA on lanyards. After a 12-hour shift, you are released into the night. The back service routes provide shortcuts to the stages, and those AAA passes come in handy. But backstage is a disappointing porter cabin, a plastic bin full of beer. The VIP bar is dull and flat. But at the front of the crowd, crazy, dancing, wild, furious, you let go, you fling your limbs. Those people are having a good time. You're in the kitchen of an artist studio in South London. You join a meeting about the demise of your cooperative, a change of structure, having had your arms twisted by the local council who would rather lease a building to a charity than a cooperative, because a cooperative exists only for the benefit of its members, right? Cooperatives aren't mentioned in the UK government website in their advice on choosing a legal structure for your business. An industrial and provident society is hardly a 21st century entity.
Put your palms together and feel the energy flow back and forth through your arms and hands. You're on the trading floor of the 17th floor of a tower in Canary Wharf. You sit at your computer, and under your feet you feel a soft, thick pile carpet. Next to you, Abercrombie and Fitch get the go-ahead for a new factory in South Africa, financed by bonds. Somewhere far away, the immaterial becomes material. Who owns debt? How can you own debt? The industry of debt keeps us in our places. Debt for education, debt for housing, debt for getting by. Stagnant wages, part-time unemployment, 0-hours contracts, public service cuts. We surrender our futures to the banks. Governments justify austerity as an overspend on a credit card that has to be paid off, right? You're in a corner of Epping Forest, on the outskirts of London. Dog walkers, speed walkers, joggers, horse riders, and Sunday strollers. You walk under the beech trees, feeling the crunch of the beech nuts under your feet. It's harder than it should be to find a place where the birds and the wind in the trees are the only sounds, and you can't hear the roads and the cars. The City of London, under Royal Charter, is carefully managing and engineering the forest. The lengths we have to go to agree to create space for ourselves. Please take your litter with you. You're in a local library in a small town. Your footsteps on the brown linoleum. Teen novels, sex education wrapped in American suburbia, fantasy and dystopia. All the exotica hidden in silent closed books. Which of these books could take you elsewhere? You hold a book in your hand and feel its weight. Who owns the books in this library? Are we members? Are we service users? When we put the book in our bag and take them home, do we become the guardian of a little bit of public in our pockets? Councils are corporations, local administrative organisations, separate legal entities operating on our behalf. We are customer, service user, shareholder, sole trader, business partnership, limited company, limited partnership, credit union, mutual society, unincorporated association, director, trustee, board member, chief executive, prime minister, taxpayer, electorate, resident, constituent, voter, citizen, audience, passenger, spectator, member, subject, participant. To the end.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciated how you each went in into your own work and in a sense, looking at the richness within its own parameters and engaging with it within its own logic. And I suppose now it's about bridging that and looking at the crossover. And one of the things that came to my mind, and I'm just going to ask the first question to all three of you, and it I think bridges a bit of what you do with Julia, Tim, and the two of you, because you have this direct and explicit engagement with the commons, where in your case it's not direct or it's not explicit, and in some cases it's not declared at all. But I think it's something about this notion of the transmittance, the way in which information is disseminated, the commons as a common knowledge, and then access to that knowledge. And so I think there's something in that within the fact that you have your exhibitions within a house, a residential house, in which that kind of access is mediated by yourself and that kind of dissemination there. And then in relation to the commune as well, which I think has an interesting logic of a kind of the interface in which people are accepted within a kind of role. And then the final thing within the kind of the way in which, for example, now in your performance, you've kind of reconstructed the performance. It was originally kind of on the web, and so there's that kind of access there, but then you reconstructed it for this audience, and the way in which that then morphs or changes what that knowledge or that kind of work is saying or doing. So I don't know if you can all kind of just kind of maybe respond if you follow the line of thinking there. So in a sense, like the notion of like common knowledge.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting that you highlight the house, because it's true. It's not incidental. I mean, there's, I mean, everything in LA is very private in a way. Everyone lives in single-family homes, even if you're renting. I mean, not everybody, but the vast majority of the built environment is centered around the single-family home, and that actually has to do with zoning. High-density housing was, what's the word for it? Not rejected, but legislated against in Pasadena, for instance, for a very long time. So it's not surprising that it's a single-family home, but it does have that quality of a very American household. But within that, there's this tradition, I think, of artists running, I mean, I suppose colloquially you'd call it an apartment gallery, but we're using the house as an apartment gallery, which is, I think, very much an invitation for people to come into your home and to have a shared experience, which is not a shop floor or a showroom, but that is very much intentionally in your house. So in that sense, I think, I think it's useful to think of it as an invitation to look, right? And also with this kind of emphasis we put on staging these exhibitions, in looking, you're also kind of thinking about the way that we look at the things that we have, right? So abstracting a little bit from, say, a collection that might just be a form of interior decorating, but more of a collection that is designed to be looked at in a specific way. Within that, the kinds of themes that we're interested in and the work that we're looking in, I think, does have certain thematic or intellectual connections to commenting as well. One that I think was actually surprising was this, the way that it came out around the millennium. And I think it was interesting that you, Iain, mentioned that you met Cal Winslow after he had heard you talking on the radio about Y2K. And there's something about the millennium that brought out this feeling in people. And we found that in a lot of the documentation, and also especially in a film that we screened alongside the exhibition called Quiet, We Live in Public, which is about a tech entrepreneur who gets bought out of his company and uses the opportunity to stage an art project where he has all these people. He uses his dot-com fortune to basically rent out a basement in the center of New York City and stage this performance. Josh Harris uses his money to stage a performance where people are invited to live for free in this space. All food, entertainment, drugs are taken care of. Everything you do has to be filmed. It's a full giving over of your public image. We live in public, right? And it's basically this kind of premonition of social media through this kind of massive collective experiment in living constantly together under surveillance. So it's a slightly darker image of the kind of commenting that we experience on a daily basis. But certainly within the kind of realm of that, like, performance experiment, right? I would say maybe even more in the spirit of the kind of commenting we've been talking about today, Russian cosmism has come up in quite a few of the projects. And there is a distinctive quality to the kind of Russian take on what the purpose of space travel might be, which can be differentiated from the American astronaut, so to speak, in the American space program, which was developed almost directly in response to what they saw as Russian military aggression. But many of the thinkers behind Russian cosmism and the development of the space program actually have to do with a much longer history of thinking about the metaphysical experience and purpose of space travel, and the idea that even the tradition of this kind of belief that man's future is in leaving Earth, and in entering into the cosmos, they would also enter into communion with all of the people who have ever died, all of their spirits. So yeah, I wouldn't be able to go into much more detail about that, but that theme, I feel like, has kind of cropped up in unexpected places.
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I'm touching on, and I suppose it kind of comes to a really interesting point where in your talk, Iain, where you talked about the moment you realized that they were gleaning, but they didn't even have the word for gleaning, and how they had reinvented, if you like, for themselves that practice. And I think, I mean, one of the things, for example, within a kind of an architectural point of view in relation to kind of common knowledge is that we have now kind of a universalizing of, for example, like the shelter as a kind of, the primitive hut. There's this kind of base zero of a shelter, and it's there to kind of protect you. And as an architect, you design and, you put a bed in a room, and there's a kind of common knowledge or a kind of sensibility or common sense, as you'd call it, about entering a space and being and a certain expectation of how you're acting there, and you kind of design within those parameters. But I think that moment where you talked about like that they were gleaning, but they didn't even have the word, the kind of, or I suppose they didn't have the word gleaning, but they used another word to describe what they were doing. Yeah. I think, I mean, how did they describe it? What was the word they used, or kind of how did that express itself?
Yeah, right. Well, they said they called them canning. For them, it was like putting things in bottles so that, that it could have been broccoli or, all that. I mean, the loss of knowledge or common knowledge about, cooking and food ways. Actually, one of the things that it's lost its sense of, radicality, but the rejection of the Cold War portion. In flight from the suburbs, the Valium-soaked suburbs, and I described them to Tim a bit earlier. Someone came for dinner and there weren't enough portions in the freezer. They couldn't stay for dinner. So the reinvention of the cauldron, was one thing. I mean, of course, tofu becomes a sacrament, and it's easy to laugh about that. But yeah, they had to come up with all kinds of reinventions. I mean, that's one of the things about the post-industrial landscape in terms of lived experience is a kind of loss of confidence. I remember Mike Davis, who grew up on the way out in the beyond even the exurbs of LA, that going back, the sadness was given sort of, the end of a certain kind of post-war blue-collar life, was he felt that there was, it was a loss of confidence, because everything was, in a way, not everything, but many things were mediated in the way that they hadn't been. You're always, I mean, we're all living in someone else's project, more or less, and how much of it we can sort of seize back in.
I mean, one of the
small groups.
One of the things that I found interesting, I suppose, is that there seems to be a certain scale kind of to use this architectural term, in relation to the commune. And then again, in relation to common knowledge, where, you know, when we have now this kind of notion of a common language, the English language is a kind of like, you know, in a sense, disciplining force in which we have to be able to speak, otherwise we're treated slightly differently. And I think it's interesting because it has that double play, because then it becomes kind of, you know, it becomes, what's the word, more widely practiced, but not necessarily more common between people. It's a kind of strange paradox. And I suppose, I mean, it kind of relates a bit, again, to kind of connect now the dots with Ruth and your work, where I think it's interesting the kind of the disclaimer you made in relation to, for example, the consumer drone, the thing that's readily accessible, but has a series of regulatory kind of forces acting on the way in which it's used, but the way in which it's used by persons in a kind of legal sense of, like, you know, you take a hat and you do something in some way, and it's about the way in which the law can then begin to enclose you and kind of declare who you are, as in under what capacity you are acting and doing what, as in what is the kind of actual act itself, as opposed to all the other kind of surplus things that were also occurring at the time. And I think it's interesting because, as you say, like, common land that's still registers common rights. And it's about, like, I don't know if you could maybe just go a bit more on that in relation to, like, the fact that, you know, there is obviously a certain exclusion still, even within the notion of the common right, about that.
Yeah, the law, so commons were registered in, you know, this was at 68?
Can you speak a bit, sorry?
And the local, you know, town clerks and things had to say which bits of land were common. It's quite interesting now looking back at that some of them were right and some of them were wrong. And they had to kind of register what the common uses were as well. And it's only very recent, fairly recently, that being able to add more common land. You can add village greens to the register, but not common lands, but you will be able to now. But it's being adopted slowly over the country. But anyway, that's a sort of... but I suppose in thinking about that, it makes me think a lot about, well, what commoning are people doing on common land now, and what kind of commons could you register to lands? I think drone flying is one, and I was interested in how there was this sort of common airspace that you're allowed to fly up to 122.
Yeah, 122.
Oh no, is it feet?
It's meters, no?
Meters.
Yes, meters.
It's a moment of self-doubt. I thought we were
122.
122.
Yeah.
Wow. What's that extra 2 doing?
I did write it down because I thought it was quite an interesting fact. Yeah, 122 metres. I mean, and your drone will tell you how high you're flying. But also you're not supposed to fly over railway lines and roads and things like that. But yeah, so there's that. There's like, what are all these? And I think there's a lot of commoning going on, but we don't think of it like that. And I suppose and it's interesting to hear you say about the kind of fetishisation of the commons. And I think in certain circles, yes, but in kind of general population, maybe not. And for me, there's a kind of political shift there to say, God, we're in London that's just seeped in global finance and, you know, a capitalist view of property, and it's like, well, fuck that. Let's think about how we're using things, and let's completely turn the thinking so it doesn't matter who owns that bit of land or that thing or that building or that whatever it is, because it's about how I'm using it and my right to use it. And this the other one thing I want to say was about common knowledge. Was it, I suppose, about practice and the kind of experimenting through practice, and that is a way of, like, I think artists can do this and architects can do this, like testing things out through practice and through doing things together. And I think everybody here has been talking about that, which is a kind of, is a form of commoning as well.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think what's interesting about that is that there's a kind of paradox, because the practices that are most able to collaborate, also the practices that are most open to exploitation, who have, for example, a copyright, it's harder to kind of secure, or kind of being able to kind of enclose their rights is a kind of, there's a greater difficulty in that. But maybe I can also open it up to anyone who has questions, or you guys can ask questions to each other.
What about being part, like holding the thing and being part of that performance? I mean, did you, you know, in this thing of saying practice is experimentation, it's like, well, you were part of that moment where I think my practice is very, the way I approach it, I'm not saying this is how it is and that's how it is and this is what's happening. Like I'm saying, here's a question, here's a question. No, you just were part of that. Any thoughts?
I mean, one question we're building, I mean, actually two-part question. One building on Heather Moad's idea. It was interesting when you were talking, when you would mention certain comments, you would always relate the comment to an identity, actually. It was a solidarity movement, it was a particular idea. And I kind of think, okay, you know, when that relationship comes with global culture, when is, you know, if you have an ideal in your mind of moving towards something, is it that we recruit to smaller identities and work within them, or is actually global culture posing, you know, an increasing difficulty on actually moving towards kind of common something?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very, very important avenue of questioning. One of the implications of a three-way opposition, or the rejection of the identity between common and public, and looking at Lou Gottlieb's saying, like, basically he was announcing to the planet, come one, come all. And, you know, they got bulldozed 3 times because so many people came, the sewage was running, and they were able to, you know, the fire marshal came, the county shut them down, which is by way of saying a common has an outside. It's not like a public library where everybody can have it. I mean, in other words, global common is a very tense and paradoxical thing. You could say that the air is that, the atmosphere is that, but it's always somebody's local air, although not obviously, it's not always obvious what that is. I mean, so for example, we have in California a long tradition of you know, localistas are everywhere. You know, try to live in your own food shed. You know, the local is opposed to the global. I agree that the identity question is important here, but I have to say that my own children, grandchildren, particularly my little, very small grandchildren now, they are, we have higher levels of particulates coming from China on the jet stream because of they're still using coal. And so these power stations coming online, so there are higher levels of particulates coming. Particularly they're about a micron across that. This is a kind of magic size which can defeat the cilia, which pushing back stuff out of the lungs. And don't tell me that isn't a local problem for these youngsters. It's stuff, you know, so it's a local problem, but it's sourced the other side of the world. So I don't mean to, it's a very, very complicated question. I thank you for the observation about an identity being involved in that. Yeah, I think, you know, all these 3 presentations raise that question. What did you find yourself reacting against that as a kind of complaint about it, or?
No, I think actually it's an point, because when you think about it, in some sense, no matter what you talk about collective decision making, I think there has to be a collective goal, some way mediated. Whether that relates to geographically, what are my needs? I imagine someone living in China, next to a river port, will not have the same needs as someone living in the landscape of Antarctica.
Right.
But on another level, I also then think of spiritual realms. I would think as Islam, being in Jordan, but also being now in UK and East, and you have those kind of micro identities. So it's just actually that I think it is a confusion more than anything, which actually it's not a. What is the common goal towards? I think it's what do we progress towards? I think which actually then defines, where do these things kind of fall?
Thank you.
Yeah, I've been thinking about a little bit more about this accommodating question that you started with, because my first response was kind of just off the top of my head, but I was trying to also think about maybe something that brings all those different projects together, especially the later exhibitions. And it does have something to do with how we decide how and where we move towards, right? So with Y2K, it's the end of the world, right? And when the end of the world happens, are we together or are we alone, right? And I think there is a certain strain of American civil libertarianism which firmly believes that we will be alone and it's every man for himself. And actually, even in advance of the end of the world, society is not really something you can rely on, right? You better get your guns. But there are also, there's these kind of alternative visions of how we could kind of come together at this moment, right? And I think operations theater and the kind of experiments that we talked about there, there's a variety of different kind of social configurations. The theater of all possibilities is a kind of collective structure. They do all live together and continue to do so. But it is also about technoscience, right? And large investments of resources and money, especially in the military examples. So lots of resources and few participants. And so if these are visions of the future, they are visions of the future which include between 4 and 8 people at a time, right? So they're prototypical in that sense. That's obviously not the end point, but that's certainly where they start, and that's as far as they've gone for most intents and purposes. And so that does raise a question of a future for whom, right? And this comes up quite clearly when you start to extrapolate this to space settlement, right? And the politics of who goes to space and for what. Or even, you don't even have to go to space. Because projects like Biosphere 2, I think also, they don't just model like space base on Mars. They also model certain potential trajectories for our own planet, right? And who gets to breathe clean air and who doesn't, right? So it brings up this kind of environmental justice issue, but I think each of these projects, and maybe a wider way of thinking about my own research interests, and certainly Julia's as well, is this kind of memory bank of possible worlds, right? Each one presents a kind of a way of thinking through performing. I'm particularly interested in planning and planning histories. So, and this is where I think it gets to the comment that you made about living in someone else's project, right? Each planning experiment, each rehearsal of the future through these projects, each premonition of the end of the world is someone's project, right? You come up with a kind of scenario through which you play out these things. And that's also how the real world has been created, right? Like the plan for the freeways that was released in '56 is directly in LA is directly a product of the thinking, as you said, that went into the World's Fairs and imagining a kind of automotive future. That was a kind of utopian image. And those are images that I keep coming back to, images of world making, images of planning and utopian images, but also trying to find these kinds of more specific examples, everything from these laboratory experiments to the communes, where you can kind of see this stuff being tested or being experimented with. They're kind of pushing the the boundaries of that way of thinking. And ultimately, to return to Commons, ultimately how that can be understood as a set of techniques, like exhibition making, like commoning, or starting a commune, starting a collaborative. I mean, all these, I kind of think of them as an ensemble rather than one-to-one choices. But a whole set of practices that could be given away, right? So for instance, with the 710 project, the most important part is how it ends, which is with a discourse on environmental justice. And so how a kind of very well-funded white middle-class battle against the state, how those techniques can be, and that power actually, be transferred to the gateway cities. Because now that the pressure's been taken off the freeway extension and the tunnel, they've now decided that their next plan is to widen the freeway between Long Beach and the gateway cities. And those are all working class, racially diverse neighborhoods that will suffer because of it.
I mean, almost the idea of commons becomes framed as a resistance movement. I mean, there is a power dynamic.
You have to insist on it, I think. Yeah.
There's somebody a question over there?
Yeah. Thanks. This might be a bit of a ramble, but I'm going to just take up Ruth's question about what it felt like. It was interesting to think about holding something that's both a kind of part and a whole, in a sense. And at the same time, there's a moment of trust, because the only thing we can trust is your word, that it's of the same, in a sense. There's something about trust and the commons there. And then the one moment in your performance that really, really struck me was when you asked us to raise our eyebrows. And then I think the next phrase was, who owns this? And you're kind of, there's a reference to, there's a video, there's a reference to the land, but also I was thinking, well, who owns this? Is it you? It's your piece. I'm in it. It's my body. But then I don't want to own my body. I don't want ownership. So it just sat in really kind of complex things as I was watching, listening, participating, not wanting to participate, but in it. And then I thought one of the most interesting parts of your performance was at the beginning when you mentioned you declared yourself a hobbyist to bypass the law. And I thought these moments of the kind of declarative and its relation to labor is fascinating. And the kind of going to Tim's notion of, okay, there's rehearsals, and then there's a declaration, okay, we're no longer rehearsing, we're performing, or we're actualizing. And that's all a declarative moment between kind of ritual and labor or something in that kind of sense. Anyways, sitting with ritual and labor and then the declarative across a lot of your presentations. It's not a question, but a kind of response to how I was feeling or thinking.
Yeah, I'd also like to say I really appreciated the desktop realism. That's something that I play with a lot, and when it's good, it's really good.
You saying about the hobby thing does make me think about maybe there's something about professionalism and commoning as well, that they're counter to each other. Professionalism is part of a system where we are selling a certain service. It's part of a capitalist system, basically. I don't know, just the thought that being collective, learning from each other, sharing is a very different structure from the one we tend to operate in, which is a kind of a monetized professionalism, and then this thing over here is my hobby, or I'm an amateur in this thing. I don't know. But then you also talked about the kind of failure of that as well, like people just building bad houses and doing things badly because they don't know what they're doing.
Yeah, what to say about that? Some of you might be old enough to have seen the William Morris, the big exhibition at the V&A, and he was the first English communist in a way. I mean, his plan was to translate culturally Marx into the English context. But but his politics really were only confined to one room. But there was a tremendous pull quote on the wall where he's writing, I think, to Burne-Jones, and he's saying, after some particularly grisly commission with, I think, a kind of arriviste ironmaster from Yorkshire or something, and he just said, like, I spend my life catering to the swinish luxury of the rich. I mean, he was a rich man himself, but we live in a world where it's incredibly hard to find a model in which artisanal work can be.
But with that in relation to the kind of fetishization you talked about, like, I think that the fetishization of going back to nature, of having a simpler life, maybe when these things are really interesting is when they're rubbing up against each other, when commoning happens within capitalism, or that you're not sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater in order to.
Yeah. Well, that's exactly.
I mean, that's
right. Yeah,
that's the thing that I found quite. Yeah. No, but that's just to finish the Adams, because I think that's the kind of notion of performative speech, right? Like that you were talking about, the declarative, and this notion. And I think what's interesting about in relation to the commons is the kind of informality or the slipperiness of it. Like, private and public operates, as you say, in this kind of discrete form, and yet the commons is a bit. You can't encapsulate what it is, because as soon as you do it, it no longer becomes in common, right? Like it no longer. And so there's something in that, in the notion of like having to declare, I will tell the truth, for example, or I will act correct. Like, there's something. I think that's. No, I appreciate it.
No, I just wanted to mention that sort of coming together of capital and sort of some sort of communal idea. Just maybe I was curious what you thought of somewhere like Bohemian Grove, which grew up around the same time as, it seems like, the person in the Sequoias, but has like a totally different remit. But their mission was to live communally temporarily, so that these sort of captains of industry and art and culture could like come together for a weekend, and it's sort of like weekend recreational communal living. But then that's a project that has succeeded rather than failed, and it would seem it succeeded because it is in the main vein of sort of like the capitalism. It's like it lives off that basically, and it's only for a sort of fun party weekend. So just curious about your thoughts about that, and having persist to this day, starting in like the 19th century.
Yeah, well, Bohemian Grove, exactly. It's up on the Russian River, and which is an interesting point. I mean, it's called the Russian River because the Spanish Empire coming north from up the El Camino Real from Mexico City met the Russian Empire coming south. So Santa Rosa and Sebastopol meet and near the Russian River, and the ruling class rusticate in the redwoods. Well, you got to remember that conservation, in fact, I would say world conservation, the model came from California, and the Save the Redwoods League was a racist, eugenicist, ruling class project. They wanted to save a little bit of, that last portion of the wildwood. And Raymond Williams deals with this, very poignantly in his City and Country, or Country and City, whatever that book is, about whose nature exactly. I mean, the drone going over the common that Ruth was, this one here, it raises the question of commons that are productive. I mean, realtors, real estate people love the commons if it means like, clean parks and no potholes, and it's a kind of real estate utopia. But they're not so interested in material productive livelihoods, which would be the gleaning or the right to the gravel, or all those things that mean that you could actually make a living off it. And probably there's going to have to going, back to that. Certainly Bohemian Grove is it's a dystopia for sure.
Okay. I think we can continue this this conversation over some drinks. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you for coming at short notice, and thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you.